Hello everyone, it's Jeff Rich here from the Burning Archive and World Literature Archive and jeffrich.substack.com. Today I'm talking about my 100 books to read before it's too late or before you die, if you prefer blunter language. And thanks for everyone who watched my first video of this series of 10 that's looking at 10 books from my list of 100 books to read before it's too late. Shared at jeffrich.substack.com. Today we're looking at books 11 to 20. Again, it's not an ordered list. Don't read order of preference into this list. And I will go through each of them briefly in turn to let you know about some great books that you can read that are not just from the Anglophone world, not just from the European world, but from all around the world. Of course, limited by my own preferences and prejudices, personal history of reading habits. But I have read a lot of books, and I have also read the works of all 121 winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature. Most of these books are novels. I haven't been entirely strict about that, as we'll see, but most of them are novels of one kind or another. And the first book on the list is by Thomas Hardy from Britain, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Now, Thomas Hardy, great 19th century, early 20th century writer. Tess of the D'Urbervilles was published in 1891. And it describes the story of Tess Durbeyfield, a poor country girl whose family discovers they belong to a noble family, the D'Urbervilles. And it describes the social drama related to all of that. A love story, a cruel, broken love story. And it really does sort of reflect the Hardy's astute social observation, social psychological observation. He originally subtitled this book A Pure Woman, and it was something of a scandal, something of a demonstration of the cruelty of social and, I guess, gender norms in 19th century Britain and 19th century, Western world. The second book is by an American, Henry James, a kind of Euro-American, I guess, because late 19th century, the intellectual classes of Europe and North America kind of mingled in many ways, the idea that John Darwin describes as Greater Europe. And the book from Henry James, there are many of his books that are often recommended. The one I've chosen is The Portrait of a Lady, which describes Isabel Archer, a young American who inherits a fortune and indeed moves to Europe, the sort of cultural capital of the world, really, in 19th century, in American eyes, seeking independence and culture. There she marries a rather manipulative man, Gilbert Osmond, and becomes trapped in a loveless marriage. So it is a fascinating account of this long menage a trois, in a way, between North American, European, and indeed Russian culture, the three elements of Greater Europe in the ideas of John Darwin, an issue that I've described more or explored more in my world history tour at jeffrich.substack. James is notoriously a writer to read slowly and carefully. And of course, one doesn't always have the time or patience for that these days, but it's definitely worth at least spending 1 month perhaps of your life slowly going through a Henry James novel. I think you'll feel better for it. The third novel became a bestseller again, I guess, a few years ago during the coronavirus pandemic. It's The Plague by Albert Camus. Of course, Camus written a few novels, The Fall, or novellas, The Fall, The Stranger, or The Outsider. And, I think The Plague is definitely up there. It's a book I read at school. I think many people would have had the similar experience. And it is a book that many people would have perhaps returned to in 2020 and the subsequent years. It's set in an Algerian city of Iran where a bubonic plague strikes, rather more serious than the plague that struck us all in 2020. And a character, Dr. Ryu, chronicles how the different characters respond to this crisis. Again, there's a very interesting historical, social context to this. Algerian, in the period Camus writing the book, not only is it post World War II France, post Vichy, and post sort of collaborationist France, post resistance France, but it's also the period of the French-Algerian decolonisation war. And these issues are explored, I guess, in Albert Camus' book. It is, I think, superbly written in a clear style. He was a great humanist thinker, Camus, who sort of stood apart from doctrinaire leftism and ideological rightism in the 50s and 60s, and perhaps stood for something better. And there's a portrait of him at in my Nobel archive, because, of course, he also won the Nobel Prize before dying young in a car crash in the 1960s, I think, 1960s and 1950s. The fourth book is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Again, people argue which of the Bronte sisters to include in these kind of lists and which of the novels by the different people. But Wuthering Heights has certainly made it to my list. It's one of those iconic, almost mythic stories in our imagination, perhaps partly because when I was growing up in the 1970s, Kate Bush's song, The Wuthering Heights, sort of haunted the imaginations of many teenagers. It's the story of Heathcliff, a sort of an orphan child, or removed from a dysfunctional home child, raised alongside Catherine Earnshaw on the Yorkshire moors. Heathcliff, Heathcliff, the famous images you see in Kate Bush's video clip. Their love is riven by class differences and by Catherine's marriage to the gentleman, Edgar Linton, and ultimately Heathcliff becomes consumed by revenge. And it's an exploration of some of the darker emotions that drive us, cruelty, obsession, and so forth. So definitely a book to read and enjoy, more gripping, I think, than Henry James, and also a great woman novel. The fifth book is by William Faulkner, another winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, who you can read about in my Nobel archive, The Sound and the Fury. Faulkner, has a distinctive style, creates a distinctive world. It's an exploration of these long, complex sentences, the stream of consciousness of different characters. And Sound and the Fury is perhaps one of the most accomplished versions of this sort of story. It is definitely a hard read in that sense, but a very rewarding read. He, explores the stream of consciousness of a character, Benji, who has intellectual disability, and the various different sort of strengths and weaknesses of the other characters in the sort of post-Civil War South of America, and all the sort of tensions, all the sense of loss and a lost world and a betrayed world, and racism and hatreds and buried resentments. It is, a great read. So do check out The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. A writer who never won the Nobel Prize, but really perhaps ought to have won the Nobel Prize, is the Polish writer. I haven't written down his original Polish name here, but his adopted English pen name, Joseph Conrad, is of course famous, a great writer of I guess the experience of dark heroism in in the late colonial period, the age of steam globalisation, explored in the great book by John Darwin, Unlocking the World, Port Cities in the Age of Steam Globalisation. And Heart of Darkness, of course, I say of course, it's a well-known story. It's the story of Kurtz, who goes into the Congo and succumbs to the Heart of Darkness. But one wonders, where really is the Heart of Darkness? It has a mesmerising beginning where a kind of narrator, a sort of narration within the narration happens, and the character Marlowe, who's a kind of sort of cross-civilizational melded character, who's been in Africa and been in Asia and been in Europe, and somehow is sort of transcending them and yet adopting different elements of this character, reflects upon how, this story that he'd heard about Kurtz and how he travelled into the Heart of Darkness, how a young, naive man travelled to recover a failed mission in the Congo and discovered Kurtz having fallen into the Heart of Darkness. But Marlowe reflects, as he's sitting on a boat in the Thames in London, he reflects that right where he is sitting too in London was formerly, and perhaps still was, as Conrad wrote, one of the places where the Heart of Darkness lived. It was a place of madness and moral corruption. This book, of course, has been retold in the film Apocalypse Now. You can even play the game World of Warcraft, and there's a whole expansion where there's a whole set of storylines based around the Heart of Darkness, without the moral seriousness, and more turning it into a bit of a series of gags and jokes. But of course, the line that Kurtz finally issued on his deathbed to the narrator of the story was the horror. The horror. It is an absolute must-read book, Joseph Conrad, The Heart of Darkness. Quite a short book. It's really just a novella. My seventh book is also by Joseph Conrad. He's written so many great novels, it's hard to just restrict them to one. There's, Lord Jim, there's Typhoon, there's Nostromo, many others, some of whom have slightly slipped my mind right at the minute. But the one I want to focus on is The Secret Agent. And this is a novel written in 1907 that in many ways is kind of an early thriller novel, an early spy thriller novel, but it's also a portrait of terrorism. And we might think terrorism is a 21st century phenomenon, a post 9/11 phenomenon, a post 1991 phenomenon, but terrorism was beleaguering many societies across the world in the early 20th century, in the early and late 19th century. Of course, many assassinations and killings in Russia, in the British Empire too. There were programs of such attacks in India as part of the resistance to the British Empire, and of course in other places around the world. And it would flow through to the long history of terrorism in the 20th century. But this novel, The Secret Agent, focuses on Adolf Verloc, who is an agent provocateur who lives in London and is asked by a foreign embassy to commit an act of terrorism to force the British government to crack down on anarchists. It's a kind of a whole story of false flags, I guess. The plan goes wrong, and his intellectually disabled character Stevie becomes the sort of fall guy for the crime. Indeed, in many ways, Stevie is manipulated throughout this novel, and it's a quite profound portrait, I guess, of this psychological dynamic, which is known to have happened really in many cases, where the people who commit terrorist acts are often not the malevolent, omnicompetent people of television movies. They're often people who are really struggle psychologically and get manipulated by those kind of manipulative people who don't actually put themselves so much in the path of danger. It's a very chilling portrait, absolutely worth reading, The Secret Agent. Now, my 8th book is Pale Fire by Vladimir Nabokov. It is a genre-crossing book. Vladimir Nabokov was a Russian writer who, left the Soviet Union after the revolution, was one of the sort of European emigres, and then ultimately ended up in America, where he pursued a quite successful career as a literary intellectual after World War II in the USA. Famous, of course, for the novel Lolita, but that's not a topic I would recommend anyone really focus on in literature. But Pale Fire is a sort of story of a kind of a mad poet, and it's partly written in poetry and partly written as a kind of commentary, and it is a brilliant, funny, magnificent book. Very different to many other novels that you might read, very much typical of a kind of a 20th century mode of experimenting with genres and styles and self-consciously playing with the reader in the type of writing that is done. It involves an extensive commentary by the author Charles Kinbote, who claims to be a poet John Shade's friend and literary executor, but he turns out to be a rather unreliable narrator, someone who's caught up in almost, Russian emigre type illusions, Ukrainian emigre type illusions of grandeur. Great novel, and great poem also is Pale Fire. My 9th book is Speak Memory, also by Nabokov. And this is not really a novel, it's actually an autobiography, but written with his deep style. It describes his childhood in pre-revolutionary Russia, his family's exile after 1917, his education at Cambridge, and his early literary career in Berlin and Paris before emigrating to America. And it's a complex meditation on time, memory, consciousness, lost worlds, and the many obsessions of Vladimir Nabokov, including, of course, his butterflies and his father, who was indeed assassinated talking of terrorism and acts of, I guess, state-sponsored violence, assassinated in Berlin as an emigre. My final and 10th book for this video, of course, I'll be doing another 80 of these books because I've done 2 videos now of 10 each. My 10th book is Faust, Parts 1 and 2 by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, usually just known by his surname Goethe, the great German intellectual writer. He's sort of, the Renaissance man in the late Enlightenment, really, or early Romantic period. He's kind of extraordinary intellectual who I perhaps should do a whole video on another day. Goethe famously spent almost his whole life writing Faust Part 1 and Part 2. It deals with the legendary, European Renaissance type story of a scholar Faust who makes a bargain with the devil, with Mephistopheles, and exchanges his soul in exchange for knowledge and experience. Part 1 focuses on the relationship Faust has with character Gretchen and Faust's desire, love and destruction of this innocent girl. Part 2 becomes an extraordinary, poetic, allegorical imagining, which he reworked and reworked and reworked almost to the end of his life, that looks at politics, economics, art and human ambition. It is, renowned as one of the more challenging things to read. It's also one of the great works of German literature. It really ought to be kind of more widely read, and why don't you lift your culture level that little bit more by reading Goethe's Faust, Part 1 and Part 2. There's a great guide to it, I think, by Benjamin McAvoy, so do check that out on another YouTube channel. And I think if you read any of these 10 books, they are great books to read before it's too late. I'll be back soon with the next in my series of 100 books to read before you die, looking at books 21 to 30. Bye now.